Welcome to Joko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Laura Chauvin, and our guest today is Jason Reynolds. Jason Reynolds is the New York Times bestselling author of over 12 books for children and teens. In addition to being a National Book Award finalist, his honors include the Walter Dean Myers Award, several Coretta Scott King honors, and an NAACP Image Award. His most recent books are For Everyone and Lou, the final book in the Track series. He teaches at Lesley University's MFA program in writing for young people. Welcome, Jason Reynolds.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to meet you.
Hey.
So we're going to dive into some craft questions. Novelists are often advised to follow traditional plot structure, that typical 3-act structure where the hero confronts an antagonist, usually about 2/3 of the way through a story. While your books have conflict, they usually have a looser structure than that. And for instance, in Ghost, there's no real antagonist pushing back at Castle Crenshaw's goal to be a runner. In All-American Boys, the novel has a pretty open ending. There's no neat resolution. So how do you play with plot structure in your books, and why does that fit your storytelling style?
It's funny because that question has never come. I've never gotten that question, and I'm first of all, I'm just grateful that you are asking that particular question. I think for me, I only write books the way that I believe that particular story needs to be told. So even though everyone knows sort of the standard plot structure, I try not to follow any of it, only because every single story requires a different thing. And that if we were to approach every story as its own, then we give the story that which the story needs. It's the same way people think about short stories, where they say short stories they're supposed to be this particular length, usually around nowadays 20 pages or whatever it is. But if you go back to our sort of heroes, some of them were writing, Langston Hughes had short stories that were 3 pages long. Jamaica Kincaid had short stories that were 2.5 pages long, right? You write the story until the story is done. You give the story what the story needs, and every story is different. So if you pick a book like Ghost, there is an antagonist. It just happens to be himself. That's all. So you don't see this sort of person that's fighting against him, but it's his environment, it's his past, it's himself, his psyche is his own antagonist. And for me, I didn't want to put extra people in his way. I think that series in general is all about sort of how do you compete with self? How do you either decide to run from yourself or to chase after the self you want to be? And therein lies sort of the conflict, right? All-American Boy is the same way. It doesn't tie up in a neat bow, but none of my books do, only because I feel like life doesn't do that. I think it's fallacy. I think it's disrespectful to the reader to give away answers. I think our job is to lead them just to the point where they can do the rest of the work themselves. Life doesn't end, even when it does. And so.
When you were meeting with the kids at Howard County Library today, you mentioned that. You said when they asked about, especially the ending of Long Way Down being open-ended, they said, well, how does it end? And you referred to the fact that you want them to imagine the ending, that you want them to exercise their imaginations. I do. I mean, look, when it comes to craft, right, and when it comes to that particular portion of craft where we talk about how do you end a novel or how do you begin a novel, I'm one of the people who believe that you always start your novel a chapter late and you always end your novel a chapter early. And I think what it does is if you started a chapter late, usually it sort of cuts out most of your exposition and it drops you right in the middle of the minefield, which is where we all want to be anyway. If you do your job, you build context around that, right? And then you end it early because I think anyone who ties a book up and who gives the ending away or who creates like a solid concrete ending is basically telling the reader that they're not intelligent enough to do any work, that they're not intelligent enough to activate their logic and reason, let alone their imaginations. And it's my goal, especially since I primarily write with young people in mind, it's my goal to make sure that I let them know that I respect you enough, and I know that you're smart enough, you're diligent enough, you're patient enough, and you're imaginative enough to create the last 3 or 4 pages of this story. Interesting, yeah. So let's talk about, you were talking about just the relationship, I guess, between the word on the page and the reader, and having the reader plug themselves into the story. I feel like verse novels in particular are a form that is, there's a certain openness to the reader. The reader has to complete what's happening because there's so much space on the page. You're kind of given packets of information. So let's talk about Long Way Down for a minute and why you decided to do that particular book in verse form.
Well, there are a few reasons. Number one, like I was telling the kids today, number one, I don't want any young person to be let off the hook and give themselves an excuse on why they haven't read the book, right? Young people these days, and even young people in my day, we were looking for whatever felt less intimidating, whatever felt less daunting. There is an addiction to turning the page, and I have to create an environment where the pages are turning quicker so that young people would then feel that addiction and sort of that drives sort of reading sometimes. And we don't think about it that way. But the truth is, those of us who are voracious readers, yes, we love stories. We also love the feeling of completion. There's something about that, right? Number two, this story is about a kid who is traumatized and who exists within an elevator. The whole story takes place in a steel box. In order for me to make that feel feasible, I needed to sort of create space on the page where that thing could happen. You can't write a 300-page novel and have it be 80,000 words and then convince the reader that this is happening in 60 seconds.
Right.
But if I could convince the reader that a 60-second story takes place in a 45-minute reading experience, it's a little more connected because the scope is a little tighter. And lastly, the reason I chose verse is because verse in general allows a freedom that I don't think that prose always does. You can put the words on the page and you can move them around the page to figure out what works best. I like to think A Long Way Down as a Hitchcock movie, right? If you were to take, like, using space on the page, right? Using space, using font, using typeset, using size, using spacing between the letters, all these things that you can play around with in verse is the equivalent of Hitchcock would sort of like tilt the frame of the camera. So there'd be two people talking like us, but then on the screen, we'd be slightly diagonal. And he did it because he knew that subconsciously it made the viewer uncomfortable. Subconsciously, it built tension in the viewer so that he doesn't have to do much work. You're doing the work for him. And it was my job to sort of put every reader in that elevator and to make it intense and make it taut. And verse allows for that.
I think also the other thing that verse, as you say, the thing that you can do for the reader is you can create the rhythm and the cadence of somebody's voice when you're writing in verse because, well, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah.
How do you use verse to get across Will's voice?
You don't have, I think the power of verse is that the reader will by nature read the story based on where the lines are broken. So that the verse, the rhythm and the pacing of the story will be read sort of however it's mapped on the page. I am basically leading you on this. And so if I decide that I want you to pause here, I'll break the line. I'll tab the word, right? And you will do it just because your brain is going to tell you to do it. It's how we all work, it's human nature. And so I think for me, it was all about this sort of experiment of manipulation. And so you create rhythm just because it just happens naturally and you can manipulate that. But even though, I like to create rhythm in prose novels as well. When I got to Germany, when I started, my books were published in Germany, the first thing that the Germans pointed out was that all the books are written in blank verse, even the ones in prose.
Wow. Right?
That I rarely write in complete sentences, and that's intentional. Because I think that our brains don't work in complete sentences. The way we speak naturally isn't there. We don't speak in complete sentences all the time. It's all sort of, these sort of synapses and fits and sparks, and we're just kind of shooting out information the way it's being shot into us. And I think I wanted to honor that, and I always want to honor that on the page. I
think that's one of the reasons also why verse novels have done so well for kids and not for adults. Adults are so trained that the page means a full page of text, and kids are much more open to reading, as you said, for multiple reasons, because there's space on the page and it's inviting, because we can hear the character's voice more deeply in poetic lines, but also, as you say. Anyway, I wanted to also ask you about the new book, For Everyone. It's such an interesting book. It's not fiction, and it's sort of reminded me of Letters to a Young Poet. And it's got that sort of pep talk part of it. It's also got some advice, but there's a piece of the book that's all about how to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
So would you like to read from that book right now?
Of course. I'll read a bit of it. It's interesting because it is sort of a pep talk but it's a pep talk to me. You know, I think people think it's a pep talk to them. That's how it's used, but this is something I wrote to myself, which is also the reason why the book continues to echo this idea that this isn't a book of answers. This is not a self-help book. I do not know how to do anything in life. You know, I don't know how to fix it, but I do know what it feels like to have it feel broken. What I do know is how it feels. How it feels when that spirit thing won't stop raking the metal mug across your rib cage, clanging like a machine gun fired at a church bell, vibrating everything irreverent inside. Sounds like a prison revolt that only you can hear and feel. And nasty things are being said about that prison guard, that scared, controlling, oppressive part of you and everyone else. If you are anything like me, you hope it never stops. You hope the bubbling never dies down and the yearning to break out and break through never simmers. You hope the voice that delivers the loudest whispers of what you envision never silences, that it never cowers behind fear and expectations that other people strap to your life like a backpack full of bricks or books written by experts. Because if it did disappear, if the voices vanished and you were no longer overtaken by the taunts of your own potential, no longer blinded by a perfect vision of your purpose, no longer engorged with passion, what would happen? Well, I guess nothing. And to me, there is nothing scarier than nothing. Even when nothing seems to be going right, or nothing seems to be going right. I'd rather be bothered by the loud knocking on the door inside. Even though I answered years ago, the knocking continues. I'd rather my appetite be wet by a teaspoon of almost there every now and then. I'd rather suffer from internal eczema, constantly irritated by the itch of possibilities. There have been many anxious nights where darkness has slept around me, my friends cocooned in a coziness that I have yet to meet, my eyes swollen with exhaustion, my body sputtering on its way down, but my dream won't stop crying, screaming like a colicky infant. Sometimes I think it needs to be changed, but usually it just needs to be fed.
Thank you for reading that.
Yeah.
So how do you help young people cope with that prison guard, that scared, controlling, oppressive part that is in us all?
Yeah, I tell them that I got it too. I go to schools all the time, and young people always ask me how hard it is to be a writer, how hard it is to chase your dreams. And the one thing I always tell young people is that I still don't know how to use a comma, that I'm a professional, and I'm lauded, and I'm awarded, and all the things that everybody seems to value. But the truth is that I'm also a collaborator. There are people around me who still help me because it's still difficult for me. Without our editors, who are we, right? But we have to be honest about that. And that takes a certain kind of humility, a bold humility that I try to exercise specifically in front of young people to let them know that what they suffer from and what's difficult to them, if we were all being honest, for most of us is still difficult. That we haven't figured it out, that there is no answer. There's not always a finish line to these things. None of us are masters of anything, and nor should we want to be. We should be forever students, forever beginners, right? So that we can learn these things. And I think for me, it's just about telling them the truth. I don't have the answer. It's hard for you. Guess what? I'm 15, 20 years in, and it's hard for me too. But that doesn't mean it can't be done.
Right. It's interesting that you say there's no finish line, because I feel that way about your books. Like in the track series, the books all end during the track meet, but we never actually see what happens in the races.
Yeah, because it doesn't really matter.
Right.
You know, people are like, well, does Ghost win? Ghost showed up. Yeah. Ghost is a winner. Does Patina win? After what Patina has gone through, she's there, competing another day. She is a winner, and I think that's the reason why I always leave them like that. I think these young people are, that's how I talk to teachers about this all the time. They're like, oh, I'm trying to make sure I can get my kids. The school thing is crazy. My classroom is this, that, and the third. And I try to remind people, there are students in your class, you have no idea what some of those students had to do just to get there. Right? The fact that they are with you and not in the street is to be celebrated.
And loss is a huge theme throughout all of your books. So, in the children's literature community, there are people who say, I won't hand my kids a sad book. I won't hand my kids a tough book. So what do you say to people like that?
I say that it's necessary to give our kids the books that have a range of emotions so that our kids can understand that they too have a range of emotions. If you try to protect your child from that which is sad, what happens when your child is sad? What happens when your child meets a sad person and can't tap into an empathy that they've never had to actually like sharpen, an empathy they've never had to develop? I personally think that we don't give young people enough credit. I think that we coddle them because we think it's necessary to coddle them as if they don't have the internet in the palms of their hands. Right. I think we lie to ourselves often as adults, and I think our young people know that. If you were to go in any school in America, there's always one teacher that everybody flocks to. And if we were smart, we'd ask ourselves, what is it about that teacher that everybody flocks to? And 9 times out of 10, it's just because that teacher talks to them as if they're human and not as if they're just children. Right. And I think there's something to be learned from that.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back to the particular line that we talked about in For Everyone, because you mentioned the prison guard. And I think the only true villain I have read in your books is the warden in Miles Morales. So could you talk about what it was like to create a villain, even though that's not your usual way of writing?
It was strange. I'm glad, you know what, it's because you're right. He is the only true villain that I've ever written, right? There's no gray area, right? He's a bad guy. And it's Spider-Man. And so when you're writing Spider-Man, there's good guys and there's bad guys in the Marvel universe. And there's gray areas, right? But, you know, this is pretty much stories about good and evil, and there are some sort of strange moments of vagueness and ambiguity, but usually it's pretty obvious. And so it was difficult, but it was also fun to figure out how to personify bigotry. If I could take like the history of racism in America, the history of all the isms, right? And if I could put them in if I can give them arms, legs, and a face, and a backstory and a history, who would that person be and what would they look like? And that part was fascinating to think about. How do you personify an ism? How do you personify a social ill? And that's what I love most. And then it also was an interesting exercise because it helped me to connect these dots that we talk about so often around the educational systems and any inequity in the educational system in relationship to the prison population and the demographic of the prison population. And you tie all of that into sort of like the connections between the two, the police force, neighborhood stuff, all these things that we've been talking about a lot over the last 5 years, and we've been talking about in this country over the last 500. I thought it was a fascinating experiment to figure out a through line and to say, what if we were to take this idea of the school to prison pipeline and make an actual pipeline? Yeah. And what if that pipeline led to a prison? And what if that the person who owned the prison was called the warden? And what if that warden, if we were to track back his life, would have been the same person, would have been a slave master? Right. And how can we connect all of these things using the 13th Amendment, which we use as the document that freed slaves, and tie it all into Spider-Man? What a creative, it was like creative acrobats, creative gymnastics, right? And you're a writer, that's what we get off on, right? It's like, that's what we all are like.
I was going to say, I noticed that the warden's weapon is Cat of Nine Tails.
Cat of Nine Tails, you know, it's like, that book, I'm so proud of. I'm not a Spider-Man guy. I'm a Spider-Man guy as everybody else is, but I'm not like a guy who writes superhero books. But that opportunity was a special opportunity, and I said yes. And I'm so glad that I did, because it helped me to stretch, and it helped me to use these tools that I've garnered along the way and to put them in a fantastic space. So what do you think was the best thing that you learned from having the parameters of working with such a beloved character and that universe? Well, one, I learned that Marvel is a lot more bold than people even know. Because when I pitched them this idea and I sent them my first draft, their response to me, their editorial letter said, we can see what you want to say. We know you want to go all the way, and we can tell that you're eggshelling because you don't think they were going to let you. So now we're going to tell you, please go all the way, take it all the way.
That's interesting.
That was really cool. And then I think also I learned that it doesn't really matter. Like, people care about superheroes, but people care about superheroes to the point that so many people don't realize that you know nothing about who they are without the uniform on. like their lives are just being superheroes and that's all people care about, they think. But the truth is that you actually want to know who they are without the superhero cape on, without the costume and the mask. And with this particular story, it was interesting because what does it mean to be a black kid in Brooklyn who happens to be a superhero? And when you put that mask on and you're suddenly invisible, and when you take that mask off and you're still invisible, like that changes the dynamic. I also learned that superpowers aren't that super.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, he really struggles with the fact that he's Spider-Man. He walks away from it.
He walks away from it. He doesn't feel like he deserves it.
Right.
You know, and then also like if you're Spider-Man and you got Spidey sense, but you grew up in Brooklyn, that's not a superpower. That's a survival skill. And so all of those things sort of change. I mean, it was just, I learned a lot. Just thinking about things differently, it was cool.
Yeah, but I can also see that it fits what you're saying about his mask and his persona. It's the same thing that's happening, especially in the track series.
Yes.
There's a scene, I love the scene at the Chinese restaurant where the coach takes all of the newbies on the team, the defenders, out to dinner, and they all have to share a secret before they can have their knife and fork to eat. And that's a moment when the masks come down.
Yep.
And Ghost in particular shares something that he really hasn't told anybody about himself.
Yeah, I think that scene is probably one of my favorite scenes I've ever written. One, because it's a scene where you're watching young people create bonds. You're watching an elder, you're watching an adult sort of facilitate that bond, which we need to see more of in books, by the way. I write adults in all my books because I think we need to see adults. Children also need to see adults that love them. And it's also this interesting thing about young people being willing, I mean, they want to eat their food, and this is a special occasion, but it's also about, I'm willing to share if it means that sharing is going to afford me this new experience, right? It's like, I want to eat. I don't get to eat Chinese food often. The food has come, and I want to eat my food. I need the experience of eating this food. I need this experience of delight with this new thing or at least this rare thing that I get to have. And if that means I have to give a bit of myself to experience it, then I'll do that, especially if I'm doing it in a space that is safe and which I trust. And that's what we all want. I'm willing to give whatever I am for the new experience, as long as I'm giving it in a space that I feel I can trust, and you can hold my story, you can hold my secrets. And if that gives me something on the back end that is new and invigorating, then everybody wins.
Yeah, it's great to see over the course of the 4 books in the series how the camaraderie between those 4 kids develops. I'm really enjoying it. So I did want to ask you, we were talking about Lucille Clifton earlier, who was very important to us locally and to you. So poetry has a long tradition of advocating for social justice and change. I was reading through one of her poems because I was remembering something she had said. And she has a poem where she says, "I bear witness to no thing more human than hate. I bear witness to no thing more human than love." So how does the idea of bearing witness impact your work, and especially because you write for young people?
Oh, I think that's all it is. I'm glad you reminded me of that Lucille Clifton quote, because I think that's all it is. That's all I really want to do. I'm not interested in teaching any lessons. And everybody, what do you want us to learn? It's like, this is really just me saying that I am willing to bear witness to your lives, not as I project them to be, but as they are, as you live them today. I am willing to give you an opportunity to be sad without trying to fix that sadness, but to say that it is okay to feel sadness. It's okay for you to take time to process, and that you are not a half-formed thing because you are young, that you are a whole-formed thing that is young, and that your experiences are all the way true and are yours. The pain feels just as bad to me as it does to you within the framework of your life, right? And all I want to do is let them know that someone knows and someone cares, and that they hopefully will feel cared for reading these books. It's the reason that magic is still one of the biggest sort of entertainment. It's the reason why card tricks are still a thing, because everybody secretly wants to know that somebody else knows what's on their mind. It's human. We all want to believe that you know what card I picked, and whenever it happens, it feels fantastic. Even though I know it's a trick, I know it's an illusion, I know it's mathematics, I know it's all these things, but it still feels incredible when you guess the right card. That's all I'm trying to do.
And you feel that wasn't something you had when you were growing up?
No, not in books. I had it in music, I had it in movies, which is where they don't have it these days, right? But I didn't have it in books. And I think the difference between a book and music and movies is I think that it takes patience, and it takes proactivity to read a book. You have to actually want to spend time with the characters in the story. You have to devote some time and some energy. It's like building relationships in real life with human beings.
Right.
And the beauty of that is that the secrets that you two are sharing, or you three, or you four, or you five are sharing, gets to stay within the pages of that book. What an incredible thing, right? Everybody knows that you are in pain, but you get to say you're in pain and connect with a character in pain. And you can tell that character your secrets that you might not always feel like you can tell your friends and your family, and you can close your secrets into that book. And that's a special, special, special thing.
Yeah, because you've got the characters who are so concerned with their outward appearance among their peers. And well, as we wrap up, can you talk about that for a minute? How do you create a character who's a young person presenting themselves as tough and hard to the outside world, and yet their internal voice is very vulnerable and sad and hurt, like we said before, suffering a lot of losses?
Yeah, I think I know that. I think I know what that feels like. I think I'm around it all the time. I spend a lot of time in prisons, young juvenile detention centers. I just know it. I know why we dress the way we dress. I know why we turn our headphones up. I know it's all force fields. We create force fields for ourselves, especially as a young black man in particular, which is my experience, right? I know why we all wanted to wear certain sneakers and wear certain clothes and this, that, and the third, because those clothes that was armor for us. Like, that's armor, which means that underneath that armor is someone who's insecure, someone who's afraid. And we deserve the opportunity to be afraid publicly. We deserve it. It isn't always safe for us. But in these books, I want to make sure that they know it's okay. I know that you're scared because I've been there.
Right.
I know that you're insecure because I live there. Right? I have anxiety. I deal with these things, right? And I just want to be honest on the page. You give a little bit, you get a little bit back. And that's what I'm trying to do, is give a little bit of myself in hopes that they can see themselves in the books.
Yeah, and I think it works so beautifully with the first person point of view in your books to get that, because you can show the outside persona or mask as well as the deeper person inside, and what they're saying to themselves in their own mind.
Wait till you read Lou. It's all about this.
I can't wait.
Me too.
Jason, thanks for a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Laura.
Thank you for joining us today on this edition of Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life.